Chapter 20. This one is from 1898 to 1918, and we're specifically in that time period, we are looking at empire and wars. So, America becoming an empire, if you will. So, we start off this chapter, the first section we're going to go over is the awakening of imperialism. And then we're going to move on to the war with Spain. And then we are going to look at extending U.S. imperialism from 1899 to 1913. And then we'll look at Wilson, President Wilson, and American foreign policy from 1912 to 1917. And finally, we're going to also go kind of start looking at the war, right? World War I. So we'll look at fighting the war at home. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the pandemic that happened towards the end of the war. So we'll end with the Spanish flu in this chapter. All right, let's get right to it. So part of the awakening of imperialism is also our economy expanding, or the economics of expansion. And this is really looking at, right, it is looking at our economy, kind of the market economy that's happening too. So as we expanded the United States, its economy over the late 19th century, American leaders grew interested in international agriculture and industrial markets as well. And so between 1870 and 1905, U.S. exports jumped from 500 million to 1.5 billion. Most American exports went to Europe and Canada, but businessmen believed that the markets in Latin America and Asia held great promise, and so we're going to try to get in on those markets, in part because the American economy was born in a boom and bust cycle throughout the last 30 years of the 19th century. Businessmen grew increasingly concerned about the stability of domestic markets and believed that selling to foreign markets, or international markets, that would counterbalance economic and social unrest at home. Among the markets of significant interest, we have Hawaii, where American missionary, agricultural, and economic influence had really expanded since the 1820s. In 1887, the United States entered into an agreement with white Hawaiians that gave the United States rights to a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Native Hawaiians were really uncomfortable with this, though, and this growing influence of white sugar planters on the islands. And in 1891, the plantation owners and a contingent of U.S. Marines ousted the last of the royal family, the Hawaiian royal family. So they actually removed the Queen Liliuokalani, and her nationalist government. They staged a coup, essentially, the U.S. government, along with these white plantation owners, and it really laid the groundwork for a treaty of annexation with the President of the United States. And at that time, that was Grover Cleveland. He eventually is going to withdraw that annexation treaty, though, but planters remained in power in Hawaii, and the royal family will never be allowed to sit on the throne again in Hawaii, and they're going to wait for their next chance to seek annexation to the United States. And just FYI, Hawaii will become a territory of the United States. She is still considered a territory even up to World War II, when we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Hawaii will not become a state until after that. But she will be, like I said, she'll become a U.S. territory. So here's a graph for you, just looking at the millions of dollars, and this is talking about exports and imports. So U.S. exports, the millions going out in blue, right? And then U.S. imports, what we're bringing in, here in purple. So you always want your exports to be more than your imports, which for the most part we're doing that. So you can see we're really growing our market, our international market, and exporting a lot more goods than we are importing. It's a good balance. It's not really a balance, but that's kind of what you want to see. Okay, let's talk about some cultural justification. So we talked about the market economy and how it was economics, but now let's talk about culture justifications for imperialism. So markets were not the sole cause for expansion. Americans who fused the concepts of social Darwinism, eugenics, and racial science with a sense of morality and progressivism believed that they had the right and a responsibility to conquer the world. Among those who used moral argument infused with scientific racism to promote imperialism was a congregationalist minister. His name was Josiah Strong, and he wrote in his 1885 work, Our Country, that the descendants of white Northern Europeans were obligated to spread Christianity throughout the world. There's also secular arguments promoted imperialism along similar lines. And historian John Fiske, he actually argued that the spread of civilization from England to the United States, that's what actually lays the groundwork for spreading Anglo culture throughout the rest of the world. We all know what happened to other cultures when Anglo culture came to what would become the United States, right? Think about Indian culture, Native American culture. Think about Hispanic culture. That will eventually blend. I know that the Spanish conquered the Indians, but just kind of think about how we really whitewash all those cultures that were here before Anglo culture. That's what we're going to try to do throughout the rest of the world as well. Most businessmen use religion to justify their overseas expansion and encourage the broad spread of that Christianity throughout the world. In 1895, John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Cyrus McCormick established the World Student Christian Federation, an organization that sent more than 5,000 missionaries around the world. Nearly every country that was a center of American economic interest became a center for American religion expression as well. Missionaries who sought to spread Christianity in China also hoped to spread a desire for an American way of life, including the consumption of American products, what we're exporting. There's also the gender issue as well, and the process of industrialization created a crisis of masculinity, and this trend bled into the imperialist movement, in part because of those who believed that, since the Civil War, American men had failed to find venues to exhibit and enhance their manhood. There wasn't any wars for them to fight in. And anxieties about the expression of masculinity cut across class lines. Sorry, guys. And particularly in the context of the Depression of the 1890s, economic difficulties clashed with the masculine obligation to support and sustain families. In 1899, the British poet Kipling wrote a poem entitled The White Man's Burden that encouraged white men to civilize non-Western peoples in order to, really reestablish their own masculinity. Men became increasingly concerned about regaining and retaining their masculinity as women grew more active in politics and outside of the home. They also embraced humanitarian reform, moral uplift, suffrage, and political change. Alfred Mahan, I think is how it's usually pronounced, he argued that if women won the right to vote, they would pose a threat to American military security. Men who embraced and sought out war, they had even a special term for those men. They were called jingoists. And Theodore Roosevelt and some others that were really war enthusiasts, they argued that adult males of the late 19th century needed a war in order to prove their manhood. And this militarism, that led to efforts to increase the size of the Navy, and by the year 1900, the U.S. fleet boasted 17 battleships and 6 armored cruisers, becoming the third most powerful Navy in the world. And we're going to get our war. We are going to go to war. We're going to help in the revolution in Cuba, which is going to morph into the war with Spain, or the Spanish War. So a little bit of background here, what's going on in Cuba. In 1895, Cubans were fighting for their independence from Spain, right? They were a colonial or a colony of Spain at the time. They're going to have an uprising. They're trying to overthrow Spanish rule. And part of this broad effort to obtain improved living conditions for peasants and racial equality for Afro-Cubans who had been free from slavery for less than 10 years. Cuban rebels were vastly outnumbered by Spanish troops, but they fought using guerrilla warfare tactics, and they were actually kind of an opposing force to the Spanish. And the rebellion, it ends up spreading across all of Cuba in less than a year and a half. The Spanish, they will flex their military muscle through brutal tactics, which only increase Cuban resolve to continue fighting. And at the end of 1897, seeing that it had no path to victory, Spain offered the Cuban rebels home rule within the Spanish Empire. But the Cubans were like, no, we actually want full-fledged independence. We don't want to remain, part of the Spanish Empire. Nearly 1/4 of all Spanish troops in Cuba, they end up getting sick, though, with yellow fever or malaria, and the Cuban forces relied on the tropical climate as a key weapon in fighting the Spanish. In addition, the Spanish military was heavily taxed by its simultaneous presence in Africa and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, as well as in Cuba. And a rebellion by Spanish troops in Havana on January 12th, at the beginning of 1898, highlighted the overextension of the Spanish military, and it really just helped encourage the hopes of Cuban insurgents. So here's a picture for you, just to break up the talking a little bit. This is these are Cuban revolutionary soldiers. And I mean, look, it's like this ragtag army, right? I mean, this guy's not even wearing shoes. This guy doesn't even have a shirt. This guy has a holy shirt. But you can kind of tell, like, these are just your average Cubans, like, fighting for independence. They don't look like they have much military training or even the weapons, the uniforms or anything necessary to go against one of the greatest empires in the world at the time. So Americans embraced military intervention in Cuba, just as Cuban victory seemed inevitable, thus strengthening the United States' role in shaping post-war Cuba and in protecting their interests of American businesses and landowners in Cuba. So what ends up happening is we kind of come in at the last moment, and we're going to help Cuba achieve their independence. So the build-up to war in Cuba fostered the growth of new journalistic style called yellow journalism, which is going to utilize sensationalist stories to highlight Spanish atrocities in order to rally American sentiment in favor of helping the Cubans. So what McKinley ends up doing, he's the president at the time, he sends down a battleship called the U.S. Maine. And he sends it into the harbor in Havana. And it's just to, like, in case something were to happen, we're there. But if you send a battleship to a country that's in the middle of a war, that's kind of like indicating, like, we're ready to participate in this war as well. Well, the U.S. Maine, it ends up exploding in the Havana harbor, and it kills 266 American sailors. And everyone blames it on the Spanish. They think that the Spanish had put mines in the Havana harbor and that we ran into a Spanish mine, and that's what blew up the Maine. In reality, later on, come to find out, it was probably a explosion that happened on board the ship that had nothing to do with Spanish and sinking mines in the bay or in the harbor there. But the Spanish are going to be blamed. And so that's going to be a push for McKinley to ask Congress in April of 1898 to declare war against Spain, in which he stated the goal of helping Cuba win its independence, but also an interest toward maintaining an American stake in Cuba's post-war affairs. And really, like, we want to help control what's happening to Cuba after they win their independence. And so we officially went to war with Spain on April 21st. With the onset of war, McKinley, he embraced the imperialist mood of the 1890s and used the context to formally annex Hawaii and promote imperial impulses among U.S. businessmen. So, though the United States was eager, its forces were really unprepared for this war. The 3,000 Army troops, 1,000 National Guard troops, and volunteers had insufficient supplies, really heavy uniforms to be fighting in a tropical climate, and we also, the Americans, had no immunity from the same tropical diseases that had taken out most of the Spanish troops. But in spite of all that, the Cubans, they had weakened the Spanish forces, and Theodore Roosevelt, he actually resigns as Secretary of the Navy to organize his own regiment, which you've probably all heard of. They were known as the Rough Riders. African Americans made up about 1/4 of the troops heading to Cuba, but their involvement was not without conflict. So we still have some racial problems going on at home. And one example is in Tampa, Florida on June 8th. Drunk white soldiers shot at a 2-year-old black boy. They end up, luckily, not hitting him with a bullet, but a bullet did pierce his shirt sleeve. And in response, black soldiers engage in a shooting match with whites that left 27 blacks and 3 whites wounded. So we have like a race riot that happens in Tampa, Florida among soldiers. And in spite of the various challenges in the United States, that's going on the home front, the United States won the war in Cuba in just 4 months. Yeah, technically, we helped the Cubans win the war. I think we need to really be clear about that. We helped Cubans win their independence. We do end up losing 460 men in combat and more than 5,000 to disease. But the quick victory, it did prompt Secretary of State John Hay to declare it a splendid little war. So in 1898, Congress adopted the Teller Amendment, and this is important because it pledged Cuba's independence, but McKinley and other leaders argued that Cuba could not be independent until it was pacified. So Americans believed that they had liberated Cuba from Spain, in spite of the fact that actually Cuba had done most of the work before U.S. forces ever arrived, and also this racial prejudice that was there. It informed the way that the United States behaved in relation to Cuban sovereignty or their independence. The U.S. military occupied Cuba until 1902, when Cuba adopted a constitution similar to that of the U.S., but the document included an amendment that put strict limitations on Cuban sovereignty. So basically, they couldn't make any foreign treaties without having it cleared by the United States first. Passed by Congress in 1901, the Platt Amendment, and this is part of that. It banned Cuban government from entering into treaties without U.S. approval. It also allowed the United States to step in whenever Cuba's economic stability was threatened. And also, this is where we get Guantanamo Bay, that was leased to us as a naval base. After 1902, the United States remained a presence in Cuba, establishing it as a we were going to protect it as a means for maintaining U.S. economic and military authority on the island. On May 1st, 1898, right, so we've been fighting in Cuba. Now that is going to spread, because remember, we've officially declared war on Spain. So we're going to be fighting in Cuba, and then we're also going to be fighting halfway across the world in the Philippines. And so on May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey of the U.S. Pacific Fleet led an attack on the Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay in the Philippines. 2.5 months later, U.S. troops invaded Manila, prompting a rapid Spanish surrender. The Philippine Islands were constantly in the U.S. consciousness during the battle in Cuba, as the United States hoped to maintain a presence in the islands as a stepping stone to China and as a potential military station. A significant component of U.S. interest in the Philippines came from the idea that if the United States did not take control there, another European power, they would just come in and take control there. And that would really hurt our business interests in the region. So President McKinley set out to annex the Philippines, arguing that beyond its strategic interest in the United States, its inhabitants, this is where the racial component comes in, its inhabitants were uncivilized and unable to govern themselves. With that motivation, the United States justified its pursuit of control of the Philippines with both cultural, supremacist, and economic incentives. The imperialist impulse of 1898 was widely supported, but not without opposition. So you have people, some pretty big names like Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and others joined in the Anti-Imperialist League, which was founded in November of 1898. So here it is. This is Cuba, right? You can tell we do have kind of an interest here because it is so close to the United States, the Florida here. This is where we began fighting, helping Cuba gain their independence, but also halfway across the world, if you go over here into Asia, the Philippine Islands. And this is Manila Bay, where Commodore Dewey is going to launch an attack. So those that were against us expanding our empire and taking over in the Philippines, they formed the Anti-Imperialist League, and it really encompassed a range of opinions on imperialism, including the notion that the United States sacrificed its commitment to and history of independence and liberty to pursue imperialist goals. The idea is that annexation would bring cheap labor competition to the United States, the argument that the cost of maintaining military forces would be too steep, and the belief that Filipinos were fundamentally incapable of civilization. As in Cuba, the United States entered an existing battle in the Philippines and was initially treated as a liberating force, but as soon as U.S. forces began to resemble a conquering army, like the Filipinos were like, oh my goodness, they're not here to help, they're here to take over. That's when Filipino forces led by Emilio Aguinaldo began to fight back. U.S. forces responded to Filipino guerrilla tactics with racism and engaged in atrocities against Filipino troops and civilians, killing around 200,000 Filipino civilians between 1899 and 1902. Almost 5,000 Americans died in the Philippines, contributing to a decline in war morale in the United States, coupled with reports of those atrocities. that yellow journalism kicking in, and the narrative of the war transformed from a fight for American masculinity into a conflict in which the Americans were the bullies. In 1901, the United States captured Aguinaldo, and the Filipino forces surrendered, initiating 45 years of U.S. rule in the Philippines. Okay, so at this point, we've talked about removing the last monarch in Hawaii and annexing the Hawaiian Islands. We've talked about helping Cuba win their independence from Spain, but then kind of taking control in Cuba. And we've also talked about the Philippines. Filipinos were trying to overthrow Spanish rule there as well. We step in, and then we are going to become kind of doing exactly what the Spanish were doing. We're going to take over in the Philippines. Now we're going to extend that, and we're going to move on and talk about Theodore Roosevelt and big stick diplomacy. And so he's going to take office in 1901, and his philosophy on the presidency included protecting American commercial and strategic interests with force, for which he believed that the United States needed to have a stronger military. So Roosevelt, along with Mahan, embraced the idea of the United States as a major world power and wanted to position the nation as a global police officer and peacekeeper. And Roosevelt hoped that the United States might increase its influence in the Caribbean, as well as in Central and South America, and emphasized the building of a canal across Central America as really being key to that mission. In 1901, the United States and Britain, we are going to sign a treaty giving the United States the right to construct the canal, which Roosevelt believed should be situated in Panama. A site was partially completed by the French before they sold it to the United States for $40 million. And the United States needed the support of Colombia, which controlled Panama, in order to complete the canal. But negotiations are going to end up hitting a snag when the Colombian government refused to ratify a treaty with Secretary of State Hay. Roosevelt argued that the completion of the canal was necessary to keep international markets functioning, and in 1903, he sent warships to Panama City to support the insurrection against Colombian rule. Roosevelt quickly recognized Panama as independent, and he signed a treaty with a new government that gave the United States the right to build and control the canal. And the Panama Canal, it opened in 1914. It's really important to note the date because it opens right on the eve of World War I. But with its control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Panama Canal, the United States had a significant strength in the Caribbean, and Roosevelt believed that the strength supported his big stick diplomatic philosophy of brandishing U.S. authority to deter European powers from attempting to intervene in the region. In 1904, he reaffirmed the U.S. position when the Dominican Republic threatened to default on European loans totaling $22 million. Roosevelt's going to add his own kind of offshoot, the Roosevelt Quarterly, to the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which had stated that the United States would not allow intervention in the Western Hemisphere by outside powers. And in this, he proclaimed that the United States had the right to step in to prevent chronic wrongdoing in the internal affairs of any nation in Latin America or the Caribbean. It also reaffirmed the policies that Roosevelt had enacted in Panama and Cuba and confirmed that the United States saw Central America and the Caribbean as part of its sphere of influence. I just want to point out, this really made Latin America mad. Central and South America did not like this idea of us coming in. They didn't ask for it. We didn't ask permission to do this. And so there's kind of this animosity against Roosevelt and the Americas when this is made public. We're also going to start to look towards China. And Roosevelt, he expressed a strong interest in Asia and sought to ensure that the United States maintained an open door policy in China to help American businesses make inroads alongside Europeans. The United States got involved in suppressing a nationalist rebellion in China that was known as the Boxer Uprising or the Boxer Rebellion, that it happened in response to foreign investment. And in so doing, the United States earned a place in Chinese trade with European competitors. The United States further involved itself in Asian affairs in 1904 after Russia invaded Manchuria, which triggered a Japanese attack on the Russian fleet. And fearing that Japan would make serious inroads in China, Roosevelt organized a conference to negotiate peace between Russia and Japan that would leave the door to China open to the United States. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, he embraced some aspects of Roosevelt's diplomacy, but emphasized the role of business in foreign affairs through a policy of dollar diplomacy. So Roosevelt was big stick diplomacy, and Taft, the next president, he is going to do dollar diplomacy. We're just going to throw money at the problem, or, throw money at it. And by encouraging bankers to invest in the Caribbean and Central America, Taft believed that he was substituting dollars for bullets, and thus spread American influence through commerce. His policy, though, is unsuccessful, as he discovered that the dollars were an adequate substitute for bullets. In nearly every instance of dollar diplomacy, Taft found that he needed to send military reinforcements to protect American business interests overseas. Okay, so now we're going to look and kind of see what Wilson did in these foreign markets. And when he took office in 1913, his goal was to distinguish his policies and philosophies from those of Roosevelt and Taft. And what he's going to call is moral diplomacy. So you got big stick diplomacy with Roosevelt, you've got dollar diplomacy with Taft, and now we've got moral diplomacy with Woodrow Wilson. And he found that exercising U.S. power and authority was essential to maintaining American influence in the Caribbean and Latin America. Mexico is going to experience a revolution in 1911 that sparked a civil war. Wilson responded by pursuing strategies to protect American oil interests and pushing Mexicans to promote leaders from the United States, or whom the United States believed were good men. I know it's funny because Wilson thought that Pancho Villa was a good man, and that's who we're going to support. And I'm so sorry to laugh. It's funny, hindsight's 20/20. But on April 22nd of 1914, after Wilson had withdrawn U.S. diplomatic recognition of Mexico, he sent the U.S. Navy to Veracruz, where a battle resulted in the deaths of 19 Americans and 126 Mexicans. And it also heightened tensions between the two nations. He also, he was inconsistent in his alliances with Mexican leadership, supporting and then rejecting the leadership of Pancho Villa, which promoted Villa to attack Columbus, New Mexico. So Villa and his men ride over the border. They go into New Mexico and they kill Americans, and they ride back into Mexico. And Wilson's going to try to catch Villa. And so he sends General Pershing into Mexico to capture Villa in July of 1916, which deepened the divide between the United States and Mexico. And it's a complete failure. Villa and his men just know the terrain better than the Americans, and so they're able to escape every time. And eventually, Wilson will have General Pershing and his men withdraw from Mexico in January of 1917. And the withdrawal of troops from Mexico was in part a response to an escalating situation that was happening in Europe. And just to kind of go back for a second, on June 28th of 1914, a Serbian nationalist, he's going to assassinate Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered a war between the Central Powers. The Central Powers are Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. And it's those against what are known as the Allies. And the Allies were Great Britain, France, and Russia. And Italy is going to join the Allies in 1915. So the United States, though concerned about the consequences of a British defeat, we try to remain neutral. We try to stay out of it. And staying out of the war became a rallying cry of women reformers and suffragists who formed the Women's Peace Party in 1915. However, in spite of our neutrality, we had strong ties with the Allied powers. Those are Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. And we recognized that it had a significant economic stake in the war. And in 1915, President Wilson's going to authorize private loans to the Allied nations. Britain attempted to starve Germany by establishing a blockade in the North Sea, which violated international law. And Wilson disapproved of the violations, but offered only a weak protest. And to combat Britain's strategy, Germany began using its new U-boats or submarines to ambush British ships. And it warned neutral nations to keep their citizens off of British ships and out of British waterways. The British are going to create more strife between the two nations by flying the flags of neutral countries on armed merchant ships. So what they're doing, you're not supposed to... They're falsifying, right? They're flying like an American flag, but really it's a British ship with British troops and British war supplies, but they're posing as Americans in order to get by the Germans. And it creates this situation that fostered international rule breaking on both sides. And on May 15th, 1915, the British and German strategies led to an event that had dire consequences for our neutrality. German submarines, they attacked the British cruise ship Lusitania, and it killed 1,198 people. And of those, almost 1,200 people, 128 Americans were killed. So Wilson, he clung to neutrality in spite of the rapid spread of public sentiment in favor of a growing war instead of negotiating an agreement with Germany that barred the country from attacking passenger ships and provided money to Lusitania survivors. At the same time, Americans continued to travel on ships owned by nations at war, and that really heightened the chance of future U.S. engagement in the conflict. In 1916, Wilson's policies both embraced neutrality and reflected a growing interest in expressing American power. He's going to increase the size of the Army and the Navy and the National Guard, and he does that by signing the National Defense Act, but he ran for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," highlighting his efforts at maintaining U.S. neutrality. His Republican opponent, Charles Hughes, was similarly inconsistent about his position on the war and advocated peace, but also argued that Wilson had not done enough to promote the Allied cause. But Wilson's going to win re-election nonetheless. As the conflict grew increasingly tense in 1917, the United States hoped to bring both sides together to negotiate a peace without victory, one based on self-determination, freedom, international law, and an end to the international entanglements that fostered conflict. The Germans were not interested in Wilson's plan, though, and determined and said that they would ratchet up their offense forces in the belief that they could win the war before the United States would engage its military. On February 1st, Germany stated that it would attack any ship that attempted to bypass its blockade of Great Britain, and Wilson responded by arming all of our merchant ships. On February 24th, the British intercepted a telegram to the Mexican government from Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, in which he offered Mexico an alliance against the United States and promised to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico if the Central Powers won. When the U.S. newspapers revealed the telegram's content, the Zimmermann note, to the public, pro-war sentiment spiked, and following several U-boat attacks on American ships, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on Germany and the Central Powers on April 2, 1917. After 4 days of debate, Congress approved that resolution, and the United States joined the fight, though we join as an associated power rather than as an ally. Wilson promoted the decision to go to war as a moral one, arguing that the United States would be instrumental in the forging of global peace and in making the world safe for democracy. And this is you've probably heard of the term in the trenches, and this war was a trench war. And here's an example of a trench. So you can see digging down, right? And this is a wounded soldier being treated in a trench. But these men, they would have to sleep, they would have to go to the bathroom, they would have to eat in these trenches. It was a very mentally taxing war, living like that. So in 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, creating the draft to increase the size of the Army. Though American troops had little impact on the war before 1918, the U.S. Navy quickly joined the fight, working with the British to undermine German U-boat warfare. In November of 1917, the Russian Revolution installed a communist regime in Russia that negotiated a separate peace with the Central Powers, weakening the Allied cause. They really didn't want to be part of the war, and that's what they're doing. When Russia has the revolution, they back away from the war. But shortly thereafter, the U.S. troops arrived in Europe and were going to help the Allied efforts. General Pershing, that guy who was chasing Villa all around Mexico, he led 1 million troops from May through September in 1918 in defensive strategies designed to push Germans back from northern France and Belgium, and the United States lost close to 50,000 troops, and we saw another 230,000 injured. The conflict highlighted new patterns in war technologies, including the development of the machine gun, heavy artillery, and poison gas shells. American forces proved to be a significant boon to the Allies, and on November 11, 1918, Germany surrendered, ending the war. And this is when we celebrate Veterans Day, the 11th month, the 11th day, the 11th hour. To give you an idea, the Central Powers who we would consider like the bad guys, if you will, were Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. And the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Italy, Russia, but remember Russia's going to kind of back out, and that's when the United States were going to step in and take Russia's place. And then these neutral, also Greece, Serbia, these neutral nations like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain. So these are the most of the countries involved in World War I. To support the U.S. war effort, the Wilson administration mobilized progressive forces on the domestic front and in 1917 established the War Industries Board, which managed industries and the economy under the leadership of Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch. As business united with the government, organized labor saw positive consequences from the outbreak of war. After a series of strikes in 1917, Wilson created a National War Labor Board, a collaboration between unions, corporations, and the public that brought 8-hour workdays, collective bargaining, equal pay for women, and overtime pay in exchange for a promise from organized labor not to strike. The war increased employment among women, offering them new opportunities to work as operators, nurses, and clerical workers, as well as in more masculine occupations such as welding parts, oiling railroad engines, driving streetcars, and operating drill presses. The war changed many aspects of daily life, including how Americans ate. Wilson established the Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover, who urged Americans to embrace wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays and Saturdays. The establishment of the Fuel Administration also encouraged Americans to limit their consumption, suggesting that Americans take fuel holidays voluntarily. The agency also created daylight saving time, which conserved fuel by adding an hour of sunlight to the end of the workday. The Railroad Administration differed from the other agencies in that it took a more forceful action by coordinating train schedules, regulating ticket prices, upgrading tracks, and increasing workers' pay. Even after the war declaration, many Americans still were not in support of America's entry into the war, and so Wilson responded by creating the Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, to disseminate war propaganda and stimulate patriotic fervor. Creel's agency urged war reporters to limit coverage of gruesome affairs, produce films and posters that vilified the enemy, and highlighted the United States' moral cause in the war. The promotion of democracy also. The rhetoric of war encouraged groups like the NAACP to push Wilson to promote racial equality at home, particularly at a time when African-American soldiers were fighting overseas for a distinctly American cause. In spite of government efforts to win the support of the public, though, sentiment through propaganda, many Americans remained wary of the war, prompting the government to pass the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918, which prohibited anti-war protests and punished acts of disloyalty, respectively. Among the 2,000 people persecuted under the laws was Eugene B. Debs of the Socialist Party, who in 1918 told a crowd that the draft was a form of slavery. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Espionage Act, but was pardoned by President Warren G. Harding in 1921. Americans also embraced a notion of 100% Americanism. Forms of German cultural expression were banned and the names of German foods were changed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage and hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. The Justice Department also supported the creation of the American Protective League, which grew to about 200,000 chapters nationwide and cooperated with the Bureau of Investigation to spy on and turn in suspected German spies, most of whom turned out to be German immigrants who had not fully assimilated yet. Efforts to restrict German culture expression and limit American freedoms were a core component of the broader progressive trend towards social control, and in this movement, prohibitionists achieved victory. Arguments for conserving grain and controlling immoral behavior fueled the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, which banned the sale of alcoholic beverages. Wilson's rhetoric of making the world safe for democracy really appealed to many oppressed minorities living in the United States, and many African Americans served in the war, though they remained segregated. In January 1918, Wilson presented to Congress his peace plan of 14 points, a set of policies and principles designed to prevent future war, promote trade, and push for self-determination in colonies. The most significant piece of Wilson's proposal was the creation of the League of Nations, a cooperative organization of nations that would arbitrate disputes and promote peace using force only when all other alternatives had been tried. Wilson brought the 14 points to the Paris Peace Conference after the war ended, but he had difficulty winning the support of Allied leaders who believed that retribution was an appropriate course of action and were determined that the colonies would remain a part of their empires. Wilson abandoned significant components of the 14 points as a part of a compromise to ensure the creation of the League of Nations, which he viewed was the most significant measure to keep communism in check. And he agreed to a war guilt clause that levied huge economic reparations on Germany for starting the war. In the end, Wilson won his fight to establish the League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles authorized the League to combat aggression against any member nation through a collective military action. This is the birth of the UN, or the United Nations. It starts out, and it's an American idea, the League of Nations. You're going to learn. We didn't join, though. After his 6-month battle in Paris with 14 points, Wilson returned to the United States to battle the Senate over ratification of the Versailles Treaty, with particular opposition coming from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican. Lodge believed that Article 10, which sanctioned collective security efforts against military aggression, threatened the United States' ability to conduct its own foreign affairs. Lodge's position was supported by 39 senators, and that was enough to block ratification. So in response, Wilson conceded that the treaty would be modified to allow the United States freedom to conduct its affairs in Latin America. But Lodge demanded further changes that would undermine significant portions of the League's mission. Wilson and Lodge refused to compromise, and other lawmakers refused to support the League with or without a compromise. So Wilson attempted to rally support for the League, traveling around the country by train to the point where he was just physically exhausted. While on the train tour, he's going to end up suffering a stroke that left him unable to govern. So his wife, Edith, she's going to end up running the country for nearly 18 months as the extent of Wilson's incapacitation was withheld from the public. On November 19, 1919, the amended treaty failed to pass the Senate. And as the stalemate between Wilson and Lodge continued, ratification failed again in 1920. The United States, we will never join the League of Nations.